So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, we've heard a little bit about vulnerable populations and equity. The terms come up a little bit. So I'm going to take a little bit deeper dive into that with my presentation today. Okay? So I think this is a picture from Pacific Junction just from earlier this year. And I think it's a good sort of look into the theme of what I'm going to talk about is part of it is that, oftentimes we look at sort of these aggregate impacts from disasters, okay? But, thinking about equity, we're going to have to take a little bit deeper dive and see how these impacts spread across populations. And so that image is, we're seeing a lot of these in recent years. Hurricane Katrina, the rain bomb that fell with Hurricane Harvey in the Houston metropolitan area, where I went to graduate school in South Carolina, so-called 1,000-year flood in 2015, and then, of course, the massive Midwest flooding of this year. Disasters seem like they're happening more and more, and in fact, they are prolific. If you look internationally, we're seeing, thousands and thousands of disasters occurring. A lot of this has to do with changing in climate, but also, more people in harm's way. If we look at sort of the distribution of these disaster types, you can see that, globally, it's flooding that's leading the way. This is just one accounting of what constitutes a disaster by an organization funded by the World Health Organization. So they're happening more. The costs are quite high as well. So, trillions of dollars, okay? And so here globally, again, floods are in the top 2 in terms of their impacts. And in terms of number of people affected, we're having a lot of impacts. But again, these are top-level numbers. You can look here in Iowa at some impacts, and this is from a database that's been tracking disaster losses from the 1960s. And you can see sort of national, if we're just looking at property damage versus the state of Iowa, hurricanes leading the way, floods next. I think these are conflated a little bit. There's also, a lot of flooding associated with hurricanes as well. So I think there's some flood stuff that's wrapped up in this hurricane number. But then if you look at Iowa, it's, more than 70% of the property damage is happening from floods. But as Chris alluded to earlier, if you look at fatalities, it's heat that's the biggest killer nationally. So what I'm showing you is the top 5 in each one of these hazards for each of these measures. Heat doesn't show up in terms of fatalities in the top 5 for Iowa, but I was really intrigued by Gene's discussion about humidity. So even if heat is not increasing significantly with rising humidity, we could have a lot greater impacts as well. So we focus a lot on impacts when we think about natural disasters. How are they affecting us? They're major and they're increasing, but primarily when we think about impacts, we look at physical and financial measures. So I'm showing you a little table here that's sort of a cross-section between, on the top side, tangible and intangible. So tangible impacts are things that you can measure monetarily. And down on the going down from direct and indirect. So direct are sort of, first order, impacts. So my car is flooded, they're damaged, right? Indirect impacts are sort of second order. Because my car is damaged, then I can't get to work, and then I lose my job, right? Something like that. So I highlighted a few of these in blue. These are the ones that we understand the most. Although our accounting for these is quite poor, looking at all the money we spend on disaster mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, our accounting of the impacts is quite poor, especially after you get out of some of these topics that are in blue. We know very little in terms of the full impact that disasters are wreaking on our lives. So we can look at some of these top-level numbers, but I would suggest that there's many dimensions to floods. So I'm just going to, there's our interactive portion of the talk. So here's a little image here. You tell me what you see. What comes to mind? The road, water, electric lines. Oh, interesting. Okay. Disruption, not able to get to work. Okay. And I would say that, throughout my career, moving from engineering to thinking about sort of social vulnerabilities, my perspective on just an image like this changes. Now I look at this and I think about, the people. How are their lives being disrupted? Who's being impacted? In which ways? How long is it going to take for people to recover from these, if they will? Are they going to be, removed from their homes? Do they have to move, somewhere else? And so, we spend a lot of time, thinking about sort of the physical impacts of floods. And, in my engineering days doing modeling, I'm thinking about like cross sections and models and flood depths and discharge. And in response, we often think about sort of management approaches, federal policies and programs and disaster management, insurance, as all being real important tools of this dimension of management. So you can think about sort of these physical aspects, these management aspects that combine to form disasters, but I would say that the social components are also quite, big driving factors. Not all people are going to experience the same sort of physical conditions and management conditions equally because of their, sort of location in our socially stratified society. And so we can look at factors like age and whether you own your home and your educational levels and poverty levels, and we might see very different impacts to populations based on the same physical characteristics. We saw a lot of this in Hurricane Katrina. I think it started to come to the fore. We do a lot of focus on, measuring the probability of events and what is the risk for this, and, we use benefit cost analyses to understand how to prioritize, investments to protect us. But I would say that, we don't put sufficient emphasis on people in terms of how it's affecting livelihoods. And so having sort of a people-centered approach is going to lead to asking some different types of questions when we're thinking about what are going to be the impacts and how we're going to respond. And I would suggest that we should focus more on the vulnerable among our populations. And I think there's some solid reasons for this. Among them, when it comes to, sort of this trail from climate emissions to intensifying hazards to impacts, the vulnerable populations are least responsible for these, likely to have, the least capacity to deal with them, at greatest risk. And, so many of these interventions are going to be really cost effective for these populations. And taking off my scientist hat, I would add a fifth here to, I think there's a good moral reason for focusing on the vulnerable in our interventions. This notion of social vulnerability is beginning to enter the public consciousness on a national scale. You just look at media reports, seen a lot of stuff, especially starting with Harvey, that you weren't seeing in national newspapers before then. And then, of course, in Puerto Rico, after the hurricane there, you've seen a lot of stuff there, right? So Marshalltown tornado here from the recent event, Hurricane Harvey. FEMA just did a massive affordability study. Can, flood insurance is, everyone's saying, get more flood insurance as a way to protect yourself against floods. But their report basically found that, yeah, people can't afford it. And this is a major problem. There's just a recent thing with NPR. They partnered with the University of Maryland on a heat study where they looked at, I think, 70 different cities. And using some mapping, as a geographer, we're going to love that, to try and communicate and analyze problems. And so they had, these series, you could search by city, and so they have a map of income and a map of heat. Essentially what they're finding is that even within cities, places that are poorer are hotter, okay? Less tree cover, other factors involved in that. So there's something about our social structure that's leading to higher physical risk for vulnerable populations, right? And so they start to identify some of these things, right? It's the poverty, race in this case, and that these impacts are already occurring. This is not just a future scenario type of thing. Like Sylvia said in her introduction, I just served on this national panel with the National Academy of Sciences on urban flooding. And we made social as one of the sort of the four pillars of our social dimensions, 4 pillars of our report. And finding after visiting all these cities, is these impacts are falling more predominantly on socially vulnerable populations. And so, why people live more in flood-prone areas? They have limited resources for flood mitigation and recovery. Okay, so. What exactly is this notion, then, if we're thinking about the socially vulnerable? It's essentially the idea that because of social processes, economic processes, in our society, political processes, that some groups in our population are consistently facing greater impacts from hazards than others. And these are some general categories of population. Now, these are general, okay? These are population level things. These do not apply to households or anything like that. So not all poor people are vulnerable to hazards, right? These are population level findings. But these are some rationale. And so the ones in green, renters, non-English speakers, poor, race, these came up quite a bit in the National Academy studies for urban flooding, okay? There are huge gaps, though. I mean, we're just starting to understand about how vulnerability is different for different hazards, but then also urban to rural settings. There's a great need for more research on how these vulnerabilities might change in rural settings. So I've been talking a lot about vulnerability, but the title of my talk is about equity. And so what does this have to do with vulnerability? So I'm going to put up a cartoon that's used a lot in sort of thinking about environmental justice. I'm trying to, define the differences between sort of equality and equity. And so this is, looking at a baseball game, okay? And you have a fence here, and you've got some people that are looking, and you can think about these people as populations. And so there's this amenity, and people want to engage in it, but there's this barrier, okay? This fence that's in the way. And so we can think about how we allocate resources for mitigation and recovery, for example. And so one theme might be to have equality, right? Everyone has the same amount of resources, but this barrier, you can see this fence is not affecting all of these populations equally, okay? So an equity lens would say, look, we're going to divide resources based on the needs of people. And so you can see that people that are facing greater barriers might need some extra help to be able to see this ball game. The third is justice. I'm not going to talk about that today. It's like, why is this fence there in the first place, right? Let's just destroy the fence, and then we have to have all these gymnastics and try and figure out how we're going to help this group or that group as much. But you can think about sort of mitigation spending, all right? So we use the benefit cost analysis a lot for prioritizing what investments we're going to put in, okay? But if you have more highly valued property, it's going to come up more favorably in a benefit cost analysis, okay? And so people that have more highly valued assets are going to end up being protected more than those who don't, okay? If you think about recovery, many of our disaster recovery programs are focused more on homeowners than renters, because homeowners are seen as the pillars of communities. But what does this mean for renters? We heard earlier about the Marshalltown disaster, how it didn't get a federal declaration. So there were fewer funds coming into the community for recovery. So what does it mean when you have real impacts, but it's not from a massive disaster that gets federal declaration? And so there's these differences within disaster management about that pertain to equity. So in my research, I'm a big fan of the use of spatial indicators. So essentially getting demographic data that you can map, right? You can assemble into more into models. You can make into an index, for example, and you can map these to get an understanding of how vulnerability changes across geographies. This is an effort at the national level to make a social vulnerability index to hazards. And so the red are places that are higher in vulnerability, the blue that are lower. And so, serve all sorts of purposes with that. And once you have this metric, then you can ask all sorts of interesting questions about where are the most vulnerable, why are they vulnerable. And two examples I'm going to show you today, questions blue, how do social vulnerability and physical vulnerability relate? Like looking at this multidimensionality of hazards. And also in second, in green, this question about, how equitable is disaster management? Okay. So the first, how do these two relate? I'm showing you two maps here. On the left is FEMA. They're floodplain maps for the United States. You can see that there's, there's coverage it's not universal coverage. Of course, there's, it's not high populations in many of these places, but it's a really ad hoc process. So the maps are done at different times using different methods and quality of data. On the right, you're seeing a map that's been developed through some collaborators at the University of Bristol. It's a kind of a coarse floodplain map for the entire United States. Excuse me. So we're going to use this as like one layer of physical vulnerability, and excuse me, we can develop a layer of social vulnerability. There's a lot of stuff going on here in this slide, so don't worry about it. The point is that we took lots of spatial indicators and brought them into a single model, so we really only have 6 variables left. Income and wealth, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, dependency, gender and race, and indigenous. And so now we have another map of the landscape of social vulnerability across the United States. We can combine these using geographic methods. And so I really like this map. These are geographic clusters, and I'm going to explain what they mean. So in red, you have places that are both high in flood hazard and high in social vulnerability. Okay? At the national level, you can take a look at these places and say, these are the areas of highest priority. Okay, if we're thinking about sort of an equity lens, like where are the needs the highest, you might prioritize resources going into the areas that are red. Okay, the areas in orange have low flood hazard but high social vulnerability. So these may not be real priorities at the moment, but what happens with our changing climate and, with the nature of the flood hazard changes, now maybe these become higher flood hazard areas, and now we need to pay attention to them. The areas in blue are high flood hazard and low social vulnerability. But social vulnerability is not static. We have, many constant demographic change in this country. Hurricane Katrina led to this exodus of people. The fracking boom in North Dakota had massive sort of demographic changes, right? So these things are happening. Demographic change could lead to some of these places having higher social vulnerability in the future, which means we might need to think about those, okay? And so we're taking a look at these data and saying, okay, so what's going on? Well, it affects a lot of people, okay? These places with high social vulnerability and high flood hazards, about 15 million people approximately. But for some of these other dimensions, it's many, many more, okay? So it's sort of, taking a top-level number based on multidimensionality. But in these places that are both highly socially vulnerable and have high flood hazard, now, taking a deeper dive into the social dimensions, we can start to see, what's going on in these places. And so these are some of the variables where there's the biggest difference between the places that are very high in both of these dimensions and everywhere else, okay? So the value of the homes is much less, the income's lower, the rents are lower, there's higher racial percentage, fewer children in married families, and a much higher poverty rate, okay? So there's some distinct social differences where if you're just looking at sort of the physical element, you might not see these differences in our country. The second question you can start to look at with some of these demographic indicators about equity is how equitable is disaster assistance. We heard a little bit about the individual assistance program earlier. This is one of the sort of an emergency short-term recovery program from FEMA that looks at unmet needs. So after you've had insurance and after you had your own resources, do you still have unmet needs from the disaster? And individual assistance comes in with grants of up to $30,000, but the average I think is like $8,000 or something or less. And so Iowa has its own version. So Marshalltown didn't qualify for the federal one, but the state individual assistance program helped fund that. But there's other programs, the National Flood Insurance Program, low interest disaster loans from the Small Business Administration for families that qualify. If you're credit worthy and you can show that you can pay this back, now you get access to maybe $200,000 in loans for your home. And CDBG, the Disaster Recovery Program, which has been spending a lot of money on recovery in the last decade or so, but often takes another year or two for this money to start to flow. So we looked at, in the study of this 1,000-year flood in South Carolina, which aspects of social vulnerability are associated with each one of these recovery programs, which populations are these targeting, how equitable is this distribution of resources. And just from the map, I think this is the distribution of each one of these programs. The 1A is the FEMA Individual Assistance Program. This has the most number of applicants for this flood. It's over 100,000. But I want you to look just below that at C, the National Flood Insurance Program, only 5,000 applicants there, right? So this pillar, this national program that's going to help people mitigate from disasters, very few people are actually taking advantage of it for whatever reason, affordability, awareness, all sorts of stuff associated with that. So we're just not really prepared at all right now, and with increasing flood hazards, we're in a lot of trouble, I think. So where do we stand with social vulnerability? Well, there's significant, social stratification in terms of impacts. We can use social vulnerability indicators as a measure of equity, and map them, measure them, and then map them, and then use them to assess all sorts of things with respect to spending, resource allocations and mitigation, recovery, preparedness, etc. Now, I showed you a lot of stuff to do with sort of the national level, but there's nothing really stopping us from doing the same kinds of things here in Iowa. The Iowa Flood Center has done the statewide floodplain mapping initiative, so we have, really good spatial distribution of the spatial distribution of flood hazards here in the state of Iowa using current methods. So, I've been talking about vulnerability, but, the big attention in the last 5 or 6 years, 10 years has been resilience, okay? We don't want to be talking about vulnerability. We want to talk about resilience, right? Everybody wants to be resilient, right? Communities want to be resilient. So how does this idea of equity fit into disaster resilience? So what is disaster resilience? This is a definition from the National Academy of Sciences about the ability of a social system to absorb impacts, adapt to change, and withstand disruption. And so it's this idea that, when we're hit by a disaster, how does the community respond, okay? So a lot of times you turn on the TV and you hear people saying, well, this disaster's not going to knock us down. We're going to build back exactly the way we were before, right? Which is kind of a problem. Like the disasters have shown you that you're vulnerable to that, right? So the idea is that you should build back a little bit differently, build back stronger. You want to have these communities like it's a spring, like it pulls. And so, can you regain your form? Does it break? What happens? Are you in a new sort of, status quo after that? The National Academy of Sciences talks about, some characteristics of resilient communities, and one of them is sort of measuring resilience and tracking progress. And so we're going to need some sort of spatial indicators to be as part of that process, and sort of the social dimension is important as well. So with climate change, there's some new urgency for flood resilience. This is a cartoon from the Army Corps of Engineers talking about all these different programs that can be put in place that can reduce overall flood risk. Community can be involved in zoning and risk communication, evacuation plans, all sorts of these things. And so in the end, you get down to the right side and your residual risk is quite low. But then this is another aggregate number, okay? How does this risk then, vary across populations? How does, zoning, risk communication, all of these efforts, if they're not explicitly taking a look at equity along the way, they're going to miss it, okay? And so I'm trying to say I think this needs to be a central framing. This slide is from my colleague Craig Just at the University of Iowa talking about communities that flood repetitively. The idea is they lack resilience. And so he's talking about, in Cedar Rapids, there's this one street essentially, like one was like protected and it was like dry, and one was not protected and it was wet, and sort of using this as sort of a metaphor for this larger idea of resources and resilience. So on the dry side, higher value, economic value of assets, more income. And here's another thing, sort of representation in decision-making processes. Who is, this idea of these long-term recovery boards came up earlier, but who's participating on these things? You start trying to engage vulnerable populations, and they may not always have the time to be involved in these things and to come to meetings, and because we got other stresses and 2 jobs and childcare responsibilities and other things. And so on a climate board with the university, with Iowa City, and this is something we're always thinking about. How can we get greater representation on these, when we're making these decisions? On the wet side, by contrast, less valuable assets, lower incomes, less representation in decision making, and more vulnerable, greater vulnerability to of infrastructure. So, from the National Academies Report, it's like, we need greater investments in research, and so we can understand and have more targeted interventions. All right. So if you think about resilience, a lot of people talk about these so-called capitals or different dimensions of resilience: social, human, institutional, economic, physical. I think we have a good understanding of sort of the physical and economic dimensions of resilience. Other people I think the natural dimensions are a little bit not too difficult to understand. Maybe, we have more wetlands, for example, to retain water, and green infrastructure, these kinds of things. But the social dimension, what does this actually mean? What is this social capital, the social aspect of resilience, and it's these community characteristics that facilitate collective action, trust, building partnerships, social networks. Now, if we're talking about flood mitigation and flood recovery, I don't think it's often that people start talking about these aspects, okay? These may seem like more universal things to improve the resilience of communities, and they are. But, they're also important for, building flood-resistant or flood-resilient communities, okay? So if we take this, this social resilience lens, now it might ask us to lead us to asking some different questions. And so here's the Corderville Dam in 2008. Levee failures here in 2019. When we're building this from an engineering perspective, we might think about, what's the flow reduction from building the structure? How many acres are protected? But that's not going to tell us anything about equity, okay? These high-level indicators, it's not telling us who's protected, okay? Who bears the greatest financial impact, okay? The flood came and there was $19 million of damage in this community, but who's bearing this damage, okay? And maybe the total number isn't as important as what's the impact, the relative impact to a household, right? I've got a $100,000 home and a $500,000 home, and they both incur $100,000 of damage, okay? Well, one of these homes, the homeowners are going to be a lot more impacted than the other, okay? But if we're looking at top-line numbers, it's not going to tell us that. So this benefit-cost ratio, these top-line economic indicators are not going to tell us anything about equity. So here's we did a study where we're sort of spatially mapping these benefit-cost ratio of buyouts in Cedar Rapids. Who can access evacuation shelters? okay? We have these shelters put in place, but that doesn't mean people can get to it. I really liked Juan's presentation talking about, the coupling with the transportation to these cooling shelters, okay? And so maybe we have the capacity, but who can get there? If they get there, do they have diapers? If you have children, do they have wheelchair access? Do they have refrigerators for people that have insulin? Can they take pets? Okay? All sorts of things that are going to be really important to people who might be displaced in these shelters. Whose homes are bought out? Buyouts are seen as sort of a forward-looking way to reduce future flood risk, but we're spending a lot of money. I mean, if you think about like all the money we've put into like the Coralville Dam, and then all the money so after the Coralville Dam was built in Iowa City, this neighborhood was called Mosquito Flats, right? You could probably see that it's maybe a little flood risk, right? All of a sudden it's safe, right? Because the dam's protecting it. We build all these homes, and then it gets flooded, and then gets flooded again. And they're like, oh, we should buy all these homes out. So think about all the money that's gone into this, right? We're spending all these resources, and who's benefiting from this? Well, developers are. How the distribution of these resources, how equitable is this? Is it, smart in the long term anyways? So we think about overall some strategies for sort of reducing disaster inequalities, thinking about equity in disaster recovery and mitigation. First of all, disaggregate, okay? No top-line numbers. We want to see how these vary across populations. So in terms of both the impacts and the sort of spending, who is it affecting, who is it benefiting? Identify and map characteristics of social vulnerability. Some characteristics are universal, some may be hazard specific, okay? So like the Polk County map, mapping that across space, you can see how these different characteristics vary within a community. Another approach is maybe to develop and apply an equity toolkit in spending. Okay, so toolkit. So 1970, the National Environmental Policy Act came out, right? It's this idea that when you're having these great expenditures at a national level, using national dollars, federal dollars, you have to think about the environmental impacts to that, right? In a variety of ways. The equity toolkit will say something similar. Now you need to look at the social impacts. So what is the plan you're going to do, right? Maybe you're going to put in a levee. Maybe you're going to have a new evacuation plan, okay? What are the social equity implications of that, okay? Is there a gap in social equity? If so, how are you going to address it? Who's going to be responsible for it? And so in planning process, and who's going to be at the table when you're making decisions, okay? So this an equity toolkit gives you a way to have a more formalized process for including equity in these spending decisions around disaster resilience, okay? And so I'm going to leave it there, just kind of 3 big points that, disasters are prolific. They're everywhere. They're increasing. The impacts are high. We can think about addressing equity through the development of social vulnerability indicators that we can map. And then when we're thinking about resilience, do not forget the social, okay? It's more than the natural and the physical and the economic. The social dimensions of resilience are important. And I would argue just as important as the other dimensions, okay? So thank you for your attention. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. I have 2 shout-outs to my graduate student, Asif, who helped with some of this analysis and maps, and Craig. I've had lots of conversations over the years, and I stole that slide from him too. So, yeah, thank you.
If you have questions for Eric, I'll...
Hello, Eric. A question occurred to me as you were showing some of the big maps, the national map and even state maps, with the county level differences in terms of vulnerability. And I understand how some of those things like the social vulnerability index has been rolled out. But as you know, coming from a place like Chicago, and I look at something like Cook County, which has as many people as this whole state of Iowa, the county level data doesn't mean a whole lot in terms of assessing this issue. We really have to get down to much more granular data, not even at the municipal level, because there's the city of Chicago. But even within the bigger suburbs, we really have to get it down to neighborhood levels and looking at housing value patterns and income patterns and so on. But I mean, as a planner, I know we can do that because we have maps of that very same sort of thing for other purposes. The real challenge is how do we integrate that into the way we respond to hazards? How do we integrate that hazards data into what we do in everyday planning? And I wonder if you could kind of address that in the context of what you're talking about.
Yeah, it sounds like there's two things there. One is a scale issue. Certainly a county level analysis is going to be useful if you're looking at the national scale. As you get to more local areas, you're going to need to reduce, go down in scale. So like, for instance, Juan in his Polk County map was looking at data at the census tract level. But that points to actually challenges once you need to get below that. Neighborhood scale, especially in rural areas, sort of census data are not going to be as useful. And so I think you're going to need to have some more qualitative data collection, meaning people are going out and talking to people, right? Surveys, interviews, these kinds of things to have an understanding of how these processes are playing out. And oh, by the way, it might give us greater insight to what's going on in our own communities anyway, so there's, other benefits to that. The other is sort of this lack of integration between disaster planning and other types of planning, right? These comprehensive plans that, cities and counties do periodically often maybe have a disaster aspect that's separate from that, right? But given that disasters are happening more and more, they really should be integrated. So the decisions you're making about, watershed protection or transportation should be integrated with your decisions you're making for disaster planning.
Should we entertain a discussion on the state level or nationally about advising people that you shouldn't live in this area that's prone to flooding? And I'm thinking about the disasters on both rivers in Iowa, and we simply don't have the resources to fix up, restore. And would it be better to say maybe we should have a discussion about the advisability of living in areas that are flood prone?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A lot of it came up after Hurricane Katrina. It's like, why, this place is below sea level. Why are we, supporting this? I would say a few things. Number one, people are attached to the places they live. There's value in the communities and the relationships, and people want to maintain that. So there's going to always be some resistance to that kind of approach. B, even with greater information, that may not lead to different action. We see this with the National Flood Insurance Program. They have this stuff about, but there's still a lot of people that aren't translating that, even if they can afford it. A third is that where are the hazardous places? Okay, we can map the floodplains now, but most of our FEMA maps don't take into account future conditions. And so in the Houston study for the National Academies, we found people that bought their home, they did everything right, they got insurance, they're out of the floodplain, and then 30 years later, the floodplain's grown into them. Okay? And the fourth, there may be just barriers for people leaving. I can't afford it, my business is here, my family's here, I can't leave. So yeah, I think that's a great discussion, but we should also think about all the challenges associated. It's quite complex. Good point.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. First question is, when you talked about the cost-benefit ratio, I happen to be the representative in the district in southwest Iowa, Fremont and Mills County. If we did not have an Interstate 29 and a Burlington Northern Railroad corridor in my district, I doubt if we would meet the cost-benefit ratio to fix all the levees. And yet that's the livelihood of the western side of the state, being able to have the interstate. And most of my major economic development in my counties occur in that corridor because of the railroads, the interstate, the people, and the rivers. So, I mean, to me, the cost-benefit ratio as far as the federal government set up is a one-size-fits-all, which, you know, we repair everything on the coast because their cost-benefit ratio is so high, and ours is so low that, you know, there's a lot of areas in our state that won't meet that. And then secondly, my concern is that as you look at my cities, I lost 3 entire cities, partially of a 4th city. Now, one of those cities has never flooded in 150 years. It's only had seep water in it. So all of a sudden, when the federal government kicks in with their FEMA programs and their buyouts and everything else, it's a one-size-fits-all. Even though the CBDG grants, the HUD grants, in the flood in eastern Iowa in 2011, or 2008, excuse me, allowed them to go back into parts of those cities and rebuild them. Now, all of HUD's wardship matches that of FEMA. So they become so rigid that I have a city that's never flooded before that completely affects one of my whole counties. And yet, if we're going to do the buyouts, we can't rebuild there. Even though the water and the sewer's there, it's tied to another city. So, I mean, we have these huge concerns that this one-size-fit-all program doesn't work everywhere. And how do we address that as a nation and also as a state level to figure this stuff out? Because it's a problem that we've seen not only in Cedar Rapids, but now in western Iowa. And yet the rules have been changed so much between these two floods that we can't even deal with it now in western Iowa. And it's just going to be a huge detriment to my counties. So.
Yeah, I mean, you know, at a national level, you can see the allure of having a one-size-fit-all approach. You know, how can FEMA or how can, at the national level, to compare priorities for investment in California versus Texas versus Iowa if they're using different metrics, right? So, but you're right, you know, it's not working.
Well, and that comes back to the income levels you talked about.
Yeah.
The income levels in most of these cities that I have are lower income because of the fact that that's where they live because they are lower income. You know what I mean? So then that affects them, and that's where they can buy affordable housing. So it gets back to this whole affordable housing
So
issue too.
this benefit cost, we should keep in mind that it's the economic benefit cost, okay? We're not talking about, what I would suggest is like a greater impact of sort of a social benefit cost in these calculations. And actually in the Army Corps of Engineers, they have like 4 criteria, and the 4th one is like other social effects, which is not used actually for prioritizing, water resources investment. But I think, you know, the way that we're going with sort of the income stratification growing and income only being one dimension of vulnerability, there's others, that we need to have a more nuanced approach for, you know, what should be the priority. And it's not just based on economics, you know, otherwise it's like the places that are poor that they're deemed just not of value, you know.
Any more questions for Eric?
Hi, my name is Fran Parr. I'm from Pacific Junction. I'm one of Dave's constituents. My question has to do with the memory of these events and how long that endures, if you've done any type of research on that. That's probably one of my overriding concerns right now.
Yeah, I guess there's kind of 2 types of memory. One is, or at least, the memory of people and how that's affecting their decision and the stories they tell. I encourage you to connect with Barbara Eckstein over here. She's involved in sort of a public history project about extreme events in Iowa and sort of these historical narratives and the stories that are told and how they affect people's awareness and maybe even decisions. But the other is sort of institutionalized memory, Okay? How, these so-called lessons learned, there's always one of these studies after these large disasters, but what is it, if it just is in a report, that's not really a lesson learned. If it becomes part of new policy, then, this translation of these experiences, these memories into long-lasting institutionalized practices, okay? That's a translation that I think is really important to occur. And so while the attention is focused on this area and recovering and all the impacts, I think there also needs to be, ideally, some ways of sort of making this new understanding permanent. Yeah.
We'll take that as the last question, and then if we have a little bit of time before the panel, then we can stretch our legs.
Well, let's do one more since we had a hand up.
This is actually an answer to the question that was just asked. There was a study done in Europe looking at how quickly towns moved back into floodplains after a river flooded. And the answer was they did not move back as long as people knew someone who was personally affected. So roughly, you're talking a generation and a half.
There's also some indication that the frequency of events really matters. So places that have more frequent impacts, that memory tends to be stronger than the ones that have it, infrequently. And it's like, well, we just had a 100-year flood, then I guess, we're good for 99 years, right? It's like, it's such a, one-off event. And so that, yeah.
Why don't we thank Eric one more time for a really engaging talk?